Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Hampton Society AGM. This is unusual for us. We have had several talks over the last few months, but this is our first virtual AGM. So please bear with us in case there are any technical hitches, but we'll try and get through it as smoothly as possible. The agenda for this evening is, as usual, we'll take it step by step, and there will be, to conclude the AGM, the election of officers and committee, which is slightly different this time because we didn't hold one last year. What I'm going to ask you to do is to elect the chair and treasurer for just 1 year, because you didn't get the opportunity to vote the chair and treasurer in again last year, or propose anyway. And then, as would happen on odd years, to propose and second the vice chair, the secretary, and the rest of the committee. So the way I'd like that to happen is, if you are able to, and you would like to propose or second any of that, the elections of the officers, I'd like you to use the chat facility, which on some computers is right at the bottom of your screen. On others, it might be at the top. And if you can't see the chat facility, it might be under the 3 circles and the more button. And it may be the first option, which says chat. And what I'm going to ask is if you would mind just putting your name down to propose at that point. But I'll come to that later on. First of all, I'd just like to share the apologies that we've received from Gareth Roberts, Suzette Nicholson, and Anselm Frost. I haven't received any further apologies, or if they've come in later, my apologies for not including them within this presentation. The first point of the agenda was I circulated the minutes held 2 years ago. Incredible to think, isn't it? Were there any matters arising from the minutes, or can we say that they're approved? If there are no matters arising from it and they are approved, could I ask somebody to propose that and then second it? This is a bit of a test. Could somebody propose that? Have you found your chat button? Thank you very much, Jacopo. And if I could just have a seconder for that. Thank you very much, Amanda. And welcome to this evening's AGM. I didn't see you earlier. Splendid. Right, gosh, that's absolutely seamless. Let's carry on. I'd like to now hand over to Brian Brignall, our Honorary Treasurer, and he's going to take you through a summary of the financial accounts for the last 2 years. Are you unmuted, Brian?
I hope so.
Very good.
Hopefully everybody else can.
And Brian is going to be the puppet master, and he's going to ask me to move the slides on when he's ready. So I shall just move to the first slide and hand over to Brian.
Thank you, William. The first slide, as you can see, gives details for the last 3 years of the financial situation. There's a trend that you can all see in subscriptions, which are diminishing, sadly. But we'll say more about that later on. And that, as you can see, makes up most of the total income for the society, which also has been reducing over the last 3 years. Obviously, during 2021, that was because of lockdown and the society not being able to meet in person. And that's also part of why we've got this reducing membership, because several people did not renew their membership during lockdown. We then move on to the total of the expenditure. Again, you can see that we had very little expenditure during lockdown, which you would expect. And the bottom figure gives the happier figures to show that despite everything, the society has continued to improve on its assets. Next slide, please, William. Now, I'm sorry if you're using an iPad or a laptop, because it's highly likely you might not be able to read these figures. But as William has said, it is being recorded, and you will be able to go back to the figures on the website later. I don't propose to spend a lot of time going through the figures individually, but you will notice that the only income which we had during lockdown was subscriptions, a few donations, and the interest on our savings account. There's a substantial reduction in that too, because the banks are not giving very much in the way of interest on deposits. We've managed, going on to expenditure, to reduce the cost of printing the newsletters that are sent out. Insurance is the same. The cost for postage and stationery is predominantly for the cost of producing the membership cards, which have all of the events. And the only other figure really worth mentioning is the lecture fees, because those of you who attended the online lectures, we did pay the people who gave those for us, and we therefore come to the same figures as the totals as we showed on the previous slide. The assets are all held in cash or bank accounts. I'll just give you the total again, which is £13,310.82. So the society has a very healthy, forward-looking way of, as I say, that's about the best thing, I feel. It's quite despondent presenting accounts when you realise that there isn't very much to say, because not very much has happened. Can we move on to the next slide, please, William? This is a better looking one, I think. This really cheered me up, because it seems to have lost some figures for 19 and 20, William.
Well, I just wanted to put that in perspective over the last range of normal years that we've had.
All right, okay.
With, if I can just interject here, as you can see, there was quite a dramatic increase in revenue on certain years, certainly 12, 13 and 15 and 16. And that was partially due to some successful events we ran, the sale of our Christmas cards, but also a drive to attract more new members. And of course, that adds to the bottom line as far as subscriptions are concerned. What you're then seeing is that starts to go up and down over the following years. But obviously the biggest effect over the last 2 years has been our lack of being able to attend any events. So although the figures for income for 2019 and 20 were sort of following the same trend, this year things have dramatically reduced. Sorry, back over to you, Brian.
Oh, thank you, that's all right. I hadn't realised you'd got some graphics that were going to add the figures in. The main reason I like this particular bar chart is the fact that we can see that for the last 10 years, the society has always had a very healthy financial position, and that income has always exceeded expenditure. And it was, you know, something that, as I say, really did make me feel a little bit better about the prospects going forward. Next slide, please. Now, this one as it says, has encouraging figures, because despite the lockdown, we still managed to acquire new members, as you can see, hopefully because the figures are bigger on this one. But it does show that there's about 43 households who didn't renew. That wasn't because they weren't contacted and reminded. They chose not to for some reason or other. But the best way for members to pay their membership fee, and having seen the people who actually joined the meeting, I think it's fair to say that the large majority of those do pay by standing order. But it's an indication that an increase of 15% in receipt of the payments by standing order does reflect the fact that if you do set up a standing order, you don't have to remember to keep paying your annual subscription.
As little as it is.
Exactly. But there is still resistance. It's almost like vaccine resistance for some reason or other. You kind of feel, why wouldn't you? So I don't want to preach to the converted, so I won't say any more on it really. But you can see that we do also lose members for various reasons. Sadly, some of them pass away, some of them move away from the area. But I don't think I can recall anyone who actually told me they wanted to cancel their membership because they weren't happy with what the society was doing, which is a good thing. And that's really what that slide is all about. And if I remember correctly, that's the last one.
Well, thank you, Brian. Thanks for that overview of where we are. I think what this highlights, though, is that when we're not able to appear or take part in events such as the Christmas celebrations in the village or the Screen on the Green or other events, people don't naturally gravitate towards us and appreciate that we are a vibrant and dynamic society with lots of members. So it just shows how important it is to attend those sorts of events. So we will certainly be intending to do that as soon as we are able to again. And I think just to, my aim, certainly my target will be to get the number of households above 500 again as soon as we possibly can. And I think that's an achievable target, and I hope to do that as soon as we're on a much stronger footing as far as being able to do things with positive effect. So moving on, it's another opportunity to propose and second. Anselm Frost has been our independent examiner for the past few years, and he is very willing to take on the role again for the next 12 months. So could I ask for somebody to propose and then second Anselm being our external independent auditor? So I'm just looking for a proposer, please. Thank you, Tricia. And then a seconder. Lovely. Right, we can move on. Which rather conveniently comes to me. I've just got a fairly brief report to share with you this evening because I do want us to get on with the matter at hand, which is letting Nick give us his fascinating talk. So to be brief, it's been an interesting year for me to consider the different types of addresses I would have given last year in comparison to this year. In April 2020, we were living in anxious times. We'd just been put into lockdown, the most extreme measures against our freedom many of us had ever experienced. And although we had hoped it would all be all right in the end, there was no idea when that end might be. I thought it would all blow over by July. And here we are a year later with, on one hand, a successful vaccination rollout in the UK with a glimpse of a return to normality, and on the other, a huge country like India showing the world what happens when complacency creeps in. Many have commented about the change in pace of life, but I've also noted a change in our expectations. At the beginning of 2020, life was about immediacy, on-demand television, next day delivery, instant results. We've now been reminded how grateful we should be for simpler and slower things in life, and how precious time has become. A time to savour with family and friends, a holiday, no matter how near or short, and the places of leisure close to home. Many of you have suddenly become very adept with technology as a means of keeping in touch and to be informed. It's also been marvellous to see so many of you attend our virtual talks. We have so far had a variety of subjects covered, from power pitches of the 17th century to our most recent talk by the police on cyber scams. We live in a special place. At a time of crisis, we are a generous and helpful community. We have great local shops and services. We have beautiful places of relaxation and exercise. Our local parks, the banks of the Thames, and even an open air heated swimming pool. At this point, I'd like to thank the members of the Society's committee for their enthusiasm and diligence in their specialist areas. We have met less than we would normally, but the committee has still managed to function. Maura has found some great stories for the newsletter that we've continued to publish. I hope you found it an informative and pleasant distraction. Linda has been welcoming new members that have continued to join us, even in the present restrictions. Brian has been making sure that all monies in and out have been accounted for. And along with our newest committee member, Leslie, Brian, Linda and myself have been looking at ways of improving the way we manage the Society's information, which has proven to be necessary and a worthwhile exercise. Even during our various lockdowns, Sylvia has been monitoring planning applications, and Jacopo has been advising with his experience as an architect. Their observations have, in some cases, helped to improve eventual outcomes. One example is the old police station that is to be converted into a care home. The now approved plans have much more outside space for residents and double the parking for staff, as a result of the observations of many local residents and the Hampton Society. Rosemary has pursued speakers to entertain us via Zoom, as we haven't been able to meet up as usual, and they've been very well attended. Over 90 people for the Eel Pie Island talk. And Alice has been in discussions with the Sailing Club and caterers for our summer party, should we be allowed to hold it in June. It is penciled in, and I will keep you updated. Thank you all for your contributions. Along with arranging our talks, Rosemary is also the secretary for the Society. After many years of service, including the entire period that I've served on the committee, Rosemary has requested that she retires this year from the role to concentrate on organising events with Alice. I'd like to thank her sincerely for the diligence and effort she has given to ensuring there is a record of our activities. Thank you. Leslie has kindly accepted to take over as secretary with your approval. I welcome her to the position. And finally, I would like to also thank all of our deliverers who have helped distribute our newsletters. I welcome any of our members to join the committee. We have a space for one on the present committee, and we welcome fresh ideas. Please drop me a line in the chat or by email if it's something you'd be interested in doing, and I really do warmly welcome anybody to join the committee. Thank you very much. Now, before I hand over to our speaker, Nick Barratt, I have the election of officers to the committee to just conclude the AGM. I think for expedience, we have 5 positions that need to be proposed and seconded. Might I ask that one of you proposes one of those 5 and another person proposes another one and another person seconds them. So if you're proposing A, just put A, or put chair, just put A, and we'll know what it is, and then put second A, and then please just dive in and propose and second B, C, D, and E, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you, John. Thank you. So we've done A, now for B.
We can't do it because we can't do the chat.
No.
Lovely, thank you. And C for our vice chair. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Denise. And D, our secretary. This is the new post for Leslie.
How do you do this anyway?
Thank you. And if I could just have a seconder for thank you, John. And finally, for the 5 committee members, lovely, thank you very much. Now, I've just had a quick note from Brian. There is something that we haven't done earlier, and I'd just like to get that tidied up. Could I ask somebody to propose that they approve the accounts that were presented to you earlier? And then if I could just ask somebody to second that as well. Thank you, Denise. And if I could just have a seconder for that. Smashing. Thank you very much. And that concludes our business. So thank you very much for attending the AGM. As I said, that will all be recorded along with Nick's talk. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the chair over to Nick for this evening's talk, Tracing the History of Your House.
William, thank you very much. And thank you all of you for lending me your time. At the moment, I am an Altonian in exile. I'm currently across the border in Surrey. I apologise for that enormously, in Ewell, but I grew up in Hampton all my life. My mother still lives there. She's been there for the best part of 50 years. So I've obviously got very fond and happy memories of Hampton. What I want to do tonight is to just talk about some of the ways you can perhaps enrich your knowledge of your local area by tracing the history of the house that you live in, or possibly another house that you've always wondered about and wanted to know a little bit more. When it was built, who lived there, that sort of thing. So I'm just going to whiz through a few slides, not too many, hopefully, and explain to you some of the key resources you're going to use. I talked earlier about getting out and about again. I think we all can't wait for that. And House History will take you on a journey around the local area, exploring records and materials in libraries and archives, chatting to your neighbours, trying to find out if anyone has any stories or anecdotes. Here's a postcard that I found just before the session from 1907, not quite Hampton, it's more Hampton Hill, High Street there, but it just goes to show the sort of material that is out there actually online. I was also struck by the number of households who are members of the Hampton Society, 443 who are paying their subs. Back in the Middle Ages, there were only 300 households in the whole of Hampton. So you're doing pretty well by medieval standards. So why would you want to do this? Well, I've given 3 quick areas there already. Historical context and links to the past. I'm guessing we all love Hampton because we've either lived there or live there now. And it's a great way of looking at your house as, in many ways, a time capsule to find out more about the area. Perhaps also you're living in an older property and want inspiration for how you might like to undertake a redecoration scheme or possibly renovate elements of it. And by going back to a particular period of its history, you might be able to find period fixtures, furniture, or inspire a new wallpaper to be created based on contemporary designs. And there is also another element too. It's been proven that properties that have a known history, particularly if that history has connections with a famous person or area. I'm told that Enid Blyton lived in the street that I grew up, that kind of thing. And of course, we've got Garrick's Villa down by the Thames. It adds value. It makes the property worth more, particularly if it's older or listed. And also it means that you can sell it more quickly. So just a couple of practical as well as general interest reasons for doing the history of your house. So I just want to run you through how you get started, a little bit about the architectural clues that you could glean by looking at your property and its neighbouring houses, How you build a timeline of what happened when, and then an exploration of who lived there before, the owners or occupiers, and finally a few clues about how you can go further and deeper into the records and into the history. So the easiest thing to do is to start by gathering clues, and I would suggest if you've got local historians amongst you, they may well have pre-researched material. Some of that will be in your local library. Local study centres often have deposited research reports, local history books, as well as photographs, newspaper clippings, and maps. It's really key, though, that you identify the house properly. And by that, I think it's probably best to find your house on older maps. Whenever I'm looking at a house from scratch, I start with a modern aerial shot of the area, and I can use that to triangulate where the house is compared to earlier maps, because obviously boundaries change, a lot of modern housing wasn't there before, and it can be quite tricky to spot your property. So start modern and work back in time. And this is really useful when you try and identify the historical boundaries that existed in the past, not just things such as the parliamentary district, or possibly some of the records that go a little bit further back, the poor law union, but also which manor existed. And I'll come on to some of those records a little bit later. So I start with this modern map, I then work further back in time and start to use this to triangulate the build date. If you have a more modern house, obviously 1864, we have the railway coming through Hampton. And so a lot of houses were built around the newly named Station Road, previously New Road. And so you can start to see that development appear on successive Ordnance survey maps, for example. You can also do an awful lot of dating of your property by looking at the architectural clues and just walking around the triangle, the heart and the historic hub of Hampton Village, and the streets radiating out from it down to the river and up into Hampton Hill, bounded, of course, by Bushy Park. You've got some really fantastic Georgian architecture. And occasionally you might find glimpses of earlier vernacular architecture that lie beneath. But you can use the way your house has been built, these standard fixtures that were prevalent at a particular date in time, to be able to assign a rough date for when that was constructed. There are all sorts of handbooks that will help you do this. I've mentioned Brunskill's Vernacular Architecture. There are a series of books called by Countryside that take you through the different periods of history. There's a lot of Georgian property, obviously, in Hampton, Georgian Regency, and then moving into the Victorian period, different styles, semi-detached and villas that stood alone, into more modern, late Victorian, into early 20th century terraced housing that radiates outwards, right up to the more modern developments with the nurseryland estates. A lot of infill going on in the 1910s and 1920s. It's not just the outside of the house that can help you date your property, but also an incredible amount of internal fixtures and fittings can be dated. Not only by looking at what they are now, but also trying to work out how your house was created and what might have gone there before. And there's a range of original records that you can go to and have a look at, things such as registered designs. And this is very much a Victorian thing with mass marketing post 1851 Great Exhibition. Lots of designers rush to fill a consumer need. And so the design registers and representations were recorded by the Board of Trade and are now deposited in vast numbers at the National Archives. And this covers virtually everything you could think of that would go inside your house. Wallpaper samples, for example, as well as Victorian technology, mangles, early forms of washing machines, as well as gas lighting fixtures and fittings. You may have some of this in your house still. So it's a great resource to have a look. Of course, you will find architects' plans, insurance records. If you've got a fire mark on the outside of your house, fantastic. Shows it was probably from the 18th, possibly the 17th century. You may find the fire mark policy number and the name of the insurance company. And that way will lead you to a ledger that explains everything that was inside the house that was insured. So really great stuff there. And inventories, often linked to when an owner dies. They might lead a probate inventory listing all of their possessions so they can be valued, potentially distributed. All of them take you inside your historic house. A few top tips at the bottom. You can compare your house to neighbouring properties. You'll often find the older houses clustered in the centre, so around the triangle in the heart of the village. But obviously you have to be careful for reuse of salvage. Lots of mock Tudor property in Hampton, built in the 20s and 30s. Waits, one particular company, building a lot of those retro style houses. But obviously, they're nowhere near as old as the style would suggest. Nice bit of backyard archaeology. Just been doing some work in my mum's garden over the last few weeks. Great lockdown activity. Been digging up all sorts of things about what might have been there before. And I've seen people who've dug up old clay pipes, old outbuildings that were buried under rubble and then built gardens on top of. Some really interesting stuff you can dig up. So what I'm suggesting now is that we build a timeline so that you can work back from the modern period and list all of the people who lived in your house, possibly understand why they might have made changes. I've given a few key sources here. Electoral lists back from the present day to the early 20th century. You get some earlier ones, but they tend to be related to ownership rather than voting entitlement. There are gaps in electoral lists from 39 to 45 because of the war. And as the franchise narrows, you get less people listed, less people were eligible to vote. But you will usually find them listed by street and then house number with the names listed therefore afterwards. These will be in main branch libraries. You can find some of these online. The British Library has a full set in central London. Street directories do a very similar thing, particularly some of the emerging directories that came from Kelly's post office directories. These again are produced annually, and they will contain all the list of people street by street. So a great way of seeing not just who was living there, but when people moved out of a house, because these records will be updated on a regular basis. And they're great for spotting changing house names or numbers, because they're sequential. You can spot those patterns, and there was a lot of house name and number changing at the end of the 19th century in the Greater London area. Rate books relate to local taxation, possibly less relevant for Hampton, but large parts of London in the 19th century had to pay sewer rates, and you'll find many of these local rates still were based property, occupancy and ownership. So you can find some of these again deposited in local archives and some libraries. Working back, most of those sources will take you through the 20th century. There are a couple of very specific sources that you can use. The 1939 register, conducted on the eve of the war, partly to see who was being mobilized for civil defense duties, partly just to make sure that people were in the right place and keeping track of internees and potential enemy aliens. These records are at the National Archives. They have been digitized, transcribed, are available on commercial genealogy platforms such as Ancestry and Find My Past. So you might need to do a little bit of searching around, but you can begin to search by street address. Less relevant, although there are and have been quite a few farms and farmlands in the Hampton area, is the National Farm Survey. Again, conducted during the Second World War. The main set of records are 1943. So if you do have any agrarian land, it's worth having a check. And quite a lot of open land was put into agricultural use during the Second World War for victory. There's a quick example of what the documents look like. You first of all need to find a map, and all of the farms or cultivated land were delineated. And as you can see on the blow up on the right, they were given a parish and a property number, which you can then use to access the actual documents themselves. The ring-fenced item on the right in yellow relates to the key on the map, and that tells you all about the fields and how they were cultivated. So it's a really nice snapshot for agrarian property. Now, this is a source that I use for both genealogy and house history. It's fantastic. It's the National Archives. And in 1910, the Finance Act was passed to evaluate the property value for rateable purposes of all land across England, Wales, and into Scotland. It's called the Lloyd George Doomsday, after the minister and the eventual prime minister who introduced it. And it ran from 1912 until war intervened up to about 1916. There were two sets of records, maps and a set of accompanying field books. And the maps, again, like we've seen in that previous example of the National Farm Survey, look at every single property, and they will give it a heritage or assessment number, including an explanation of the extent of that land, which then map into the field book, which will give you an assessment of the owner, the occupier, date of former sales, really useful if you're tracking back. What sort of interest was in the land? Was it freehold, leasehold, or copyhold? Again, useful to look into other records. And the great thing about this is that you can spot not just your house, but neighbouring property, which is great when you want to link into other data sets such as census returns. I always look for the nearest pub, not because house history is thirsty work, but because they're often very easy to spot in other records. And if you know how close your house was to a pub, you can count up and down the street when you look at census records. We'll come back to that shortly. But this is an example. It's not from Hampton, sadly. It's a property relating to a famous author. And this is a sample from one of the maps. This is an Ordnance survey key sheet. And as you can see, each plot of land is color washed, showing its boundaries, and the plot number is then highlighted up on the right-hand side. This particular property, Maxgate House in Dorchester, is given plot number 319. You can then look up the field book for that corresponding property, and you will find there 319 is Maxgate. It's a house and garden standing quite nicely in an acre and 2 reeds of property. It's valued, and there's the occupier, a certain Thomas Hardy. It's a freehold property, and you also get a little description of the house. Some of these are very unflattering, but it gives you a sense of the layout, which may or may not have changed over time. Now, I mentioned the census returns, and these have been published ever since 1801, when the first census was taken. But from 1841, the information contains details of every occupant of every household. So that's a really key data set if you're tracing the history of a house, particularly if you want to then find out a bit more about the social history of the people who lived in that house. Again, let's start with the present day and work back. Now, these records are all available online, once again, on those commercial genealogy websites, Ancestry and Find My Past. You might need a subscription for those. You might have one already if you've done some family history. But if not, most main libraries have Ancestry subscriptions you can use for free. And this is where you compare the data from the 1910 valuation survey and maybe look for the name that you found associated with your house, and then you can look for the census returns. And they jump back every 10 years. Many of the earlier census returns, though, may not give a house number, a house name, or even a street name. And that's where that pattern searching I mentioned earlier, mapping the valuation office material into earlier census returns, is really key. So if you live 3 doors down from the Jolly Coopers, for example, you can then see where your house is in relation to the Jolly Coopers on an 1851 census return. You need to know, of course, which route the enumerator took, but that is very helpfully sketched out at the start of each schedule. As an example, this is going back to Maxgate House, and here is the said Thomas Hardy, author of books. Of course, this is Thomas Hardy, who has his Wessex Chronicles, and there is his household living with him, his wife and 2 servants. This is the 1911 census. It's a great source because it tells you a little bit about the individual, what status they were. Well, we know it's a large house. It's got 11 rooms and a couple of servants to keep them all tidy and well looked after. But they were also used for other purposes. I love this particular example from 1911 because it gives you an insight into the political leanings of the occupants, or rather the daughter of the occupants. In this case, the parents were out. The daughter got hold of the form that you had to fill in, and she wrote a little bit about what she thought, very clearly supporting votes for women. She claims she's an artist and suffragette. I don't know whether you can see in the far right-hand column, which describes disability or infirmity. She says, "My disability is not enfranchised." So it's clearly a political protest. The enumerator, on the other hand, was not amused, and he crossed it out in red ink. Let's push further back. So here's another one of these really fantastic surveys we can use, and it relates to tithes, the payment of 1/10 of what was grown on land to the church to support the rector or the vicar. And without going into too much detail, by the 1830s, this process was a little bit inadequate to look after them, particularly as many rural parishes had stopped paying tithes, and there was a huge imbalance in the price of corn compared to the cost of living. So a decision was made to survey all of those parishes that still paid in kind to the rector or the vicar, and a fixed monetary rent charge was created based on a 7-year rolling average of the price of corn. And those tithes were then essentially commuted into different forms, usually money. To do this, the country was mapped, and every property was given a number linked to the map so that people could work out the extent of the land, the amount of tithes, and therefore the cost of the rent charge. So we've got the 1910 survey. We can skip back to the 1830s and 40s when the survey was undertaken. We can also look at Ordnance survey maps. It may be that your house wasn't built at this time, and of course that applies to large parts of Hampton. But you can find out who owned the land and maybe then trace forward a little bit more. So it's a really useful tool to connect into some of these areas. If there isn't a tithe apportionment, and this is an error on my behalf, I didn't check for Hampton, it may well be that an earlier form of commutation took place, often linked to an enclosure award, the enclosing of common land. And that links to manorial records, which I'll come on to a little bit later. If there's no other tithe apportionment, there may well have been an enclosure. And that's where you will find your property or the land on which it stands captured. These records are at the National Archives. You might find a set at the London Metropolitan Archives, because that covers Middlesex. Here is a depiction of the map. Below up on the right hand side, the property I'm interested in is number 184. As you can see, you've got stripped fields, you've got slight depictions of trees there, and a lot of property included as well. So from the map, you can then go to the accompanying tithe apportionment schedule. And here we have the property owned by a Sir Henry Boynton, and it's a mansion 185, and next to it is his bowling green, which is all very nice. And I thought that was quite nice compared to some of the antics that went on at Hampton Court Palace just up the road. This is another example. I think this is a beautiful map, and a lot of attention to detail was placed into the cartographic work, color washed, often to scale. You know, this is the 1830s, so it's before we get the Ordnance Survey really rolling out en masse. Beautiful documents, but they will show you how an area was at that particular moment. So they're really nice snapshot documents. And there's another example of one of the schedules. You can see there, the owner on the left-hand column, occupier, property number, a description of the property, what sort of cultivation it was in, and there's the valuation documents on the right-hand side. So those are the key surveys that should apply to most of your properties. Now we're moving into some of the unique records that may or may not survive for your property. A lot of freehold land, like we saw in Thomas Hardy's house, would have been conveyed as we buy and sell properties today. We're probably quite familiar with that, generating a title deed, a proof of descent from one owner to the next, curtailed after the 1920s, various laws of property acts. Before that date, you keep your deeds as far back as possible, because it was really key in proving you had every right to hold that land or house. After that date, the amount of time that it was kept was 30 years, reduced to 15. So modern title deeds aren't particularly detailed, but you may find historic title deeds deposited in archives and libraries. The great thing about property transactions is there is a real desire to record them. We're probably familiar with the land registry today, but they don't include historic registrations. However, Hampton sits within Middlesex, and there was a Middlesex deed registry set up in the late 18th century to record property transactions. And that's indexed by the name of the place and by the name of the parties transacting their business. So you can go to the Middlesex deed registry, the records at the London Metropolitan Archives in London, and you may well find your house being registered every time it changed hands from the 18th century all the way through the 19th. But many people took an additional step before these registries were set up to enroll title deeds, to have a copy of that transaction written in an official record, so that it could be pointed at as evidence in case anyone challenged your right to hold that land or house. Some extraordinary lengths people would go to make sure this happened. They paid vast amounts of money to have their title deeds and their property transaction written on government records, old things called close rolls, which actually extend right the way to the present day, but date back to the 13th century. Feat of fines, a process where people took out a fictitious lawsuit in the Court of Common Pleas so that the court can come to a judgment, and therefore all parties would be given a written record of that judgment, which essentially was the payment of compensation, the payment of a fee to buy the house. And they again exist in vast numbers. But of course, let's look for sale particulars and notices. Lots of examples of those increasingly in newspapers And you can search the British Newspaper Archive online via Find My Past. You need a subscription for that, but once again, free access to the British Library, and I think a fair amount of free access at local libraries too. Now, I've talked a bit about freehold and copyhold, and this comes out of the Norman Conquest. Let's go right back to 1066. And I'll give you a quick overview just because it's important to understand the routes you need to have a look at, depending on the type of property. And as we see earlier, the 1910 valuation office gives you a sense of whether land was freehold or leasehold or copyhold. Now, these are legal terms relating to the way in which land was held, descending from the manorial system set up after the Battle of Hastings, when William the Conqueror grabbed all the land in the country apart from that owned by the church, took a large chunk of it for himself as the royal domain, which is now the Crown Estate, and distributed the rest to his tenants in chief, the main aristocrats, who held land as manorial tenants from the king. And they had to perform service to hold that land, often money, usually military service, to go off and fight for 40 days on the king's behalf. They in turn had their own followers. And so this land kept getting broken up. And what you created there was a feudal pyramid where everybody owed service to someone above to hold land. The basic unit of land holding was a manor, the amount of land that could support 40 nights, one night for 40 days, a knight's fee or a manor. And it was a socio-economic unit of different geographical sizes, but always providing enough revenue to support that one night for 40 days. The lord of the manor replicated what the king did. He kept a lot of land for themselves. And then the rest of the land was distributed to the manorial tenants, either according to the customs of that manor or free of the customs of that manor. If you held land free of the customs, you were a freehold tenant, and therefore you could buy or sell that land any which way you wanted, hence registering that in the means that I've mentioned already. If you held land according to the custom of the manor, you could only pass that land at a couple of occasions each year via the manorial court that was held to regulate all business of the manor, as well as look after any wrongdoing and fine or immerse malcontents or wrongdoers. And these manorial courts are really important. So let's imagine a scenario where you have someone who holds land according to the custom of the manor. They die, their son, because often it was primogeniture, would want to inherit that land, but they'd have to wait until the next court sitting, whereupon the tenant would be recorded as having died, and the next tenant would be admitted into those lands, having first surrendered those lands to the lord to be redistributed. So this process of admission and surrender was the means by which copyhold land was regulated and passed or sold for centuries. This isn't something that goes back to the Middle Ages. Copyhold land as a means of landholding was only extinguished in the 1920s. So a lot of our property, if it's according to the customs of the manor, would have been transacted through the manorial court, and there were court rolls created for every court sitting which record these property transactions. And if you had then been admitted into your father's land, you would be given a copy of that court roll showing you were entitled to hold the land, hence copy hold. You're holding according to a copy of the court roll. Now in 1920, 3 or 4, copyhold was extinguished and all of it was converted to leasehold. So if you have any leasehold land, it may well be that you want to look at records before 1920, 1910 Valuation Office survey, the 1830s tithe apportionments, to see if you had copyhold land. And that would allow you to go for these court records. They exist in large numbers, and you can use the manorial documents register at the National Archive to spot, either by parish, Hampton, or by the manors, of which there are several in operation, where those records are held and who held them. All I would say is that there's a lot of Crown land around in the Hampton area, given Hampton Court Palace, just road, and you may need to look in the Crown Estate, so the records at the National Archives, if it's a royal manor. So that might just be a little thing you need to look at. Alongside these court records, there were a whole variety of other estate records that were created to help the lord of the manor get the most out of their land. Usually, the court was presided over by the lord's steward, and the steward would also be in charge of the finances of the manor. So you find that the steward's accounts are really key. They would often work on a series of charge and discharge where they were charged with bringing in all the revenue due to the lord of the manor from rents or fines or other sorts of financial transactions. And then they would discharge any expenditure they've been authorized to make over that same period, usually repairs on houses, repairs on roads, stocking the lord's fields, etc. So you may well find a lot of information about improvements or repairs to houses in the area. But equally, you may find some of your previous occupants caught up in these records, particularly if they were encroaching on other people's lands, grazing their cattle or sheep on common land without the Lord's consent. They may be charged with financial transactions, fines, immersements, and they will be recorded in the steward's accounts. So you may find something there. Equally, you may have ancestors who lived in the area who were tradespeople or merchants. They may be supplying goods to the manor. So you may find them picked up as well. Periodically, the manor would have rentals or surveys conducted upon it. You may find manorial maps drawn up to help with that, where anyone who owes rent to the lord will then be identified and depicted as to where the land held, and possibly any previous occupants noted as well. A lot of material there in local study centres. So, you know, London Borough of Richmond upon Thames, the Richmond Study Centre will have some as well as your library, and of course some additional material in the Middlesex records in the London Metropolitan Archives. So land ownership is a really great way of tracing your property through time. There's an example of one of those manorial court records I mentioned, the Manor of Long Sidon there, and this one's in English. I should point out that all of these records before 1732 are going to be in Latin, but you might want to compare a Latin version to one of these much more clearly written English ones. Another way to transact your property was to leave it to somebody in a will, but there were limitations on what you could or couldn't leave. Freehold land could only be transferred in a will after 1540. Copyhold land was far more restricted. The law was only eased in 1815. And you might find that a property isn't mentioned in wills, or there's no surviving will. Someone dies intestate, or they've made other arrangements. They don't need to make a will because their only son is going to inherit all their property, for example. But if you are looking for property ownership, and you do know a little bit about the people who live in or around your area, you might want to look for their last will and testament. I'll just skip to the English records. Anything after 1858 is available online to download. If you go to gov.uk and look for probate material, you will find an index. It's indexed by individual. Anything before 1858 was regulated by church courts because they were given the right to prove that the will was accurate. Hence, they were all written in Latin. Probatum est, it is proven, hence it's called probate. Chances are it's going to appear either in the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, if the property was worth more than £5 or £10, potentially a diocesan record office. Most of the Canterbury records, as in the Archdiocese's records, are going to be at the National Archives. So you can search by name, you can download the wills still, I think, for free. You certainly could during lockdown, if not for a small amount of money. And it will give you a lot of information, not just about the deceased, but also their particular requests, near point of death, and also some of their household possessions. They may have left a probate inventory to their executors saying how they wanted their goods distributed, leaving their tools of trade to particular people, for example. So it's a really great source to get a sense of who the people were, how they lived their lives. One of my favorite is a London lawyer, Sylvester Pettit, who died at the early part of the 18th century. He died without children, and he left most of his property to a charity to support young people get into the law in his native Yorkshire. But he had this really great London house, and he listed all of his possessions, and I mean all of them: the Turkish rugs on the floor, the walnut carved tables, the framed pictures of some of his clients and his benefactors, room by room listed. It's a fantastic resource, and they were also found in the National Archives. Sometimes, though, property inheritance did not go to plan. And you will often find that property disputes either relating to the validity of title deeds or the validity of inheritance, ended up in court. And more often than not, an equity court was chosen because, unlike common law courts, it had the ability to provide restitution to the wronged party rather than punitive punishment to the wrongdoer. The main courts in operation from the 14th, 15th century onwards was the Court of Chancery, presided over by the Lord Chancellor. But by the 17th and 18th century, so large and voluminous in business that they had 6 clerks looking after different divisions of its business. Other courts existed, the Court of Exchequer, which may be relevant because they handled disputes relating to crown tenants or crown land. The process is the same. An individual will bring a bill of complaint against someone who they're claiming has done them some wrong, some sort of disinheritance or some forgery of the title deeds. They'd bring the bill of complaint, setting out their charge against the defendant. The defendant would then have to answer that charge, provide a written statement of why it's wrong. That would then trigger a replication from the complainant, setting out why the defense is also erroneous, which would then lead the defendant to provide replication again. So it's basically iterating the point of law through this process of backwards and forwards, bills, answers, rejoinders, replications. Eventually, the judge will step in and say, okay, thank you for that. We now need more evidence. So they issue a decree, either striking the case out or asking for more information, ordering for interrogatories to be drawn up, a list of questions drawn up by both parties to be presented to people with knowledge of the case at hand, often the older folk in the local area. They would then provide their depositions or affidavits in response to those interrogatories. All of this would be gathered back into court. Occasionally, additional evidence would be provided by both parties, such as any historic title deeds, copy of court rolls, marriage settlements, wills, etc. And ultimately, a final decision would be reached, although often cases were settled out of court. Now, all of this evidence exists in vast numbers. The records are primarily kept at the National Archives. And the great thing is they're indexed and they stretch back into that medieval period, right the way through to 1875, when Chancery and other courts were shut down and amalgamated into the Court of Judicature, and they continue from that point onwards. There are decree and order books that allow you to work out what was happening when, so you can then go hunting for these other records. But the bills and answers are all indexed by name and by place and by court and by the type of plaintiff. So it's a really great resource if you have got a few names, you've got a suspicion about some of your characters who lived there before, particularly if there was a newspaper article. My goodness, the newspapers love these sorts of property disputes and would write up about them. And then you can go into the National Archives and have a look at some of these other materials as well. Now, I just want to close with a few thoughts about how you widen your research. Most of what I've described so far, particularly the section about the land surveys, should apply to all of your houses. With a bit of diligent searching, you may well find some of these property transactions. You may find some of these disputed legal cases. You should find some of the manorial records. But these things depend very much on local events at either a national or local area. So dissolution of the monasteries. Now, this played out just down the road from Hampton. Hampton Court Palace, of course, as we know, in the possession of Cardinal Wolsey, who fell foul of Henry VIII and lost his property. But there is evidence that there might have been a few monastic institutions, possibly a chantry in Hampton as well. The records are a bit murky, but there was certainly indication that there was some monastic land in the area in the 1520s and 30s. So that may have fallen into lay hands. And any monastic land seized as part of the dissolution of the monasteries was either kept in crown hands and leased out or eventually sold. And the Court of Augmentation handled all of these sorts of transactions. And those records are at the National Archives. Let's skip forward a century and look at the English Civil War. Not just fought on the battlefields, but also fought in the law courts, because the two sides would sequester property held by the opposition in areas that they controlled. And we've got a lot of records for the victorious parliamentarian sequestration committees that would seize royalist land, crown land, or suspected sympathisers, and then either get those to pay a large amount of money to get their property back, or they would just sell it on. So it's a great resource trying to track down what happened to property during these moments of upheaval in national life. And often you'll find that after the restoration of Charles II in 1660, many of the previously dispossessed people went to the equity courts that I've just described to get their property back. So it's a good time to again start looking for property. Most of these records, again, are at the National Archives. Other archives may be available as well, but National Archives has a lot of this stuff. And there are printed calendars, summaries of these records, which you can go and have a look at. And you'll find a great amount of information there. Jumping ahead quite a long way now, we have bomb census surveys. I think Hampton was relatively unscathed during the Second World War, but if you remember, we had the 1939 register, we've got the National Farm Survey, we've also got bomb census survey. So during the Blitz, when you had the V1s and latterly the V2s landing in and around Greater London, census records were constructed. I don't mean as in the household census, but the place where the bombs dropped were plotted on Ordnance survey maps and were color-coded to show the extent of the damage caused by the explosion, with reports about any casualties and what remedial action has to be taken. So if you find a nice row of Victorian houses and there's suddenly a big gap in the middle with something that looks like post-war infill, chances are a bomb hit the area, worth having a look. And of course, you've got history unique to Hampton. I've talked already about the Victorian period, the coming of the railways, 1864, the change of name from New Street to Station Road, the further expansion as Hampton became a bit more of a commuter town, and the buying up of land, including the nursery lands, as we know, towards the Uxbridge Road, which has a lot of infill back into the 80s and 90s. The spreads, as we've seen, can be linked to this transport network, but there's also light industry appearing throughout Hampton's history. A few factories. I remember a candle factory burning down in the 70s. Saft, I think, is there or was there. You can spot the old trades and commercial premises, which may or may not still be there anymore. And we've heard how quickly it is that a former use building can change into new hands with the conversion of the police station into a nursing home. And so all of these unique factors will drive the change in a local area and affect houses as well. And this isn't just about continually rebuilding new things. There are some clearances, local authority planning coming in through the 19th and 20th century. My first foray into house history was when I was 16, and we were doing it as a school project, and the chosen street was Station Road. And I can remember some of the houses going up in that scrap of land between the road and the railway near the dip in the 70s, other bits being knocked down. So you start to spot some of these authority planning permissions, which increasingly survive in large numbers. And just a couple of miscellaneous sources there. I've talked about tax in the form of rates, but there's all sorts of other tax, land tax, window tax. If you're going really far back, hearth tax. And you may see some of these things, particularly the land tax, picking up some of the gentrification of Hampton in the Georgian period. Land tax records survive up until about 1832, often in quarter session records, often at the local archives. And it tended to pick up the wealthy folk who not just paid tax on their land, freehold land, but also therefore got the right to vote. So land tax returns were kept as pseudo voting slips, and you'll find lots of people recorded there alongside their property. I've mentioned insurance records already, but you'll find all sorts of utility records starting to appear as gas and of course water was connected up, and we've got the reservoirs, another Victorian creation, starting to define Hampton further down by the river. Lots of personal papers, which Hampton and the houses will be mentioned. Of course, I've said about Garrick's Villa already and the famous residents who lived there. They often recorded their time. And Johnson's famous quote about, death is made sadder by leaving places such as this, when he visited Garrick's Villa in the first instance, just give you a snippet about what life was like. So it is worth casting the net a little bit wider. So hopefully in 40 minutes or so, I've given you a very whistle-stop tour of some of the sources you can use to trace the history of your house. And hopefully once lockdown eases and we're all a bit more confident and safer, this might be something that you want to undertake yourself. It's a great way to get out and about. It's a great way to meet the neighbours, to swap stories, possibly even a fantastic local history project to create a digital version of the sorts of things that we do. Don't just make it about going back in time. Record your time in the house. We've all spent a year indoors, essentially. And in generations to come, people will be fascinated about what we did in lockdown. It will be part of the story of your house. As for many of us, our houses became our place of work, our schoolrooms, and our refuge from the outside world. Possibly worth chronicling that in a 50, 100, 150 years time, who knows? Someone else might be sitting here with some other device, wondering what on earth we got up to back in the pandemic of 2020 to 21. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Incredible.